So as I stand here, I realize three things. The first is that that is going to be an impossible act to follow. The second is that I'm the only person standing between you, dinner, drinks, and a dance party. And the third is that I'm a huge pain in the ass. So first of all, when I was coming here about a week ago, I get a call on my cell phone. It's from a number I don't recognize, and I answer it, and it's Emily. And she doesn't say anything. She just says, "Oh my God, you're alive." And the reason is that I was very busy, was a little bit flaky in communicating. So thank you, Emily, and all of the organizers for putting up with my nonsense in this, and it's just a testament to how hard you all work. So thank you very much. When Emily reached out to me and asked me to come speak here, she said, you know, that the theme that we're going to be doing this year is Alice in Wonderland. And I was like, that's awesome, because the last couple of years have been like really, really weird. They've been really weird in technology. The last time I was here was 2019. That was like 8 weeks before the pandemic started, and then the entire world fell apart. And in that time, like a bunch of weird stuff has been going on. It's been going on in the world. It's been going on in technology. And I started to think, you know, what is actually happening? What are we doing? What are we building? How do we relate to how we're building technology and how the world is changing, right? And you know, this is not a talk about activism. I was introduced as an activist. This is a talk about the future. This is a talk about futurism, about technology, and what is changing. And as I began working on this talk, before I begin, just for anyone here, there's a couple images that I have that might be a little bit disturbing, and there's some GIFs that might be a little bit animated. So if you get dizzy or anything, just feel free to look away. As I was working on this talk, I started thinking about, you know, what is it about revolution? You know, as an activist, I study revolution. I've traveled the world, and I've been to the places where people have risen up against governments, against oppressors. I've also been part of technology revolutions. You know, I was developing websites back in the 1990s when nobody knew what they were doing or how to do it, and it was very strange. And we all knew that this was a new way of building an economy, but we had no idea how. And then I've been through some things. I've been, you know, in war zones. I've been in riots. I've been in these weird situations. And I think that if there's one characteristic of any sort of revolution, any sort of rapid period of change, it's that at the end of the day, they're all just very, very weird. And if you've ever experienced something like that, you know, there's things that are scary, there are things that are uncanny, there are things that are unsettling when the world is changing around you so fast. But I think that everyone that I've ever talked to who's been through these situations will tell you, actually, the thing about it was things are actually just really, really strange. When we look at technology, when I went and studied, you know, the word revolution and how it's been used in the past with technology, I see a lot of things about how technology is revolutionizing industries like music, right? And you know, you think about it. I remember Napster back in the day. I went to a university where the Recording Industry Association of America sued a student for like $49 billion because he ran a network search service. This was back in like 2002. It was called Find. You know, a lot of change has happened in the world. But at the end of the day, when we look at what has actually changed, it's a little bit of user behavior. You know, you might listen to Spotify instead of buying CDs. Unless you're like a real, true music nerd, you probably don't go to a lot of record stores anymore. But it's the same recording companies, and it's the same big shot artists, and there's some statistics. There's this New York Times article from last year that says, you know, the streaming model actually has just made the divide between the superstar artists and everyone else even bigger, right? So it hasn't helped the artists. It maybe has helped the users a little bit discover some new artists, but it's actually put much more burden on musicians to go tour and perform. And of course, during the pandemic, that wasn't possible. So it took a lot of their income away. We could look at other industries like publishing. We talk about how it's easier to be published if you're writing a book, if you're writing, you know, for a blog. It's easier to get your message out there. But in the United States, 91% of hardcover releases are published by the same 5 companies. It was almost 4 companies, but just last week, the US government blocked a merger. And you say, okay, well, maybe you don't have to publish. You can self-publish. We have the internet now. But of the $1.25 billion worth of self-published books that are sold each year, 92% of them are sold through Amazon. So what is actually the revolution here? It's the same people getting the money. It's the same people getting richer, right? What has changed? If you want to write a book, you still have to write the book. If you're self-publishing, you probably don't have an editor. That probably means that the book is not going to be as good as it could be. So what has actually changed? Could look at another example. I could go on, but every industry that we look at, it's the same thing. Technology has changed how the industries work, but it hasn't actually created a revolution. In the United States, over the past almost 20 years, some 2,500 newspapers have shut down. That's over a quarter of newspapers operating in the country, and by 2025, the estimate is about to be a third of those will have shuttered. So we see technology doing disruption. And when people are doing disruption with technology, they like to talk about how they're revolutionizing something. And this is where me as an activist, I take issue with that word, revolution. So I started to look into this, and as I was writing this talk, I had a pretty negative opinion back in April of this year, which was 150 years ago. Had this really negative opinion about NFTs and things like that, and it was everyone's saying this is revolutionizing art, and I'm like, no, this is a bubble. It's obviously a bubble. Everyone knows it's a bubble. Turned out it was a bubble. But we also started talking about things like the Metaverse, things like cryptocurrency dramas and all of these things. And I'm like, that's not a revolution. I started to look into it. I started to wonder, what is it about technology that is creating this dynamic of the same industry or the same people, the same players in the same industries, just using technology to retain the power and the wealth? There's something else that's been interesting about the last couple of years. I did a lot of research on how technology has been infusing itself into these industries. We look at this, I'm a consultant, we look at what industries are adopting technology, what industries have to digitize, and there are a couple, construction, agriculture, that have not really adopted a lot. There's still a long ways to go. But actually, almost everything is starting to digitize now. There are very few industries, at least in the developed world, that are not moving things into computerization, that are not looking at how to use AI, things like that. And so I think that as developers who always want to be on the cutting edge, we've started to think about revolutionizing different things. In this case, I think that we're starting to think about how do we actually revolutionize the industry that we created? How do we revolutionize the web? And a lot of people talk about this. This is sort of the whole Web3 nonsense. And if you look at the history of the internet, we've had a couple of different ways of doing it. We had the World Wide Web, or Web 1.0. Then we had Web 2.0, and that was a different thing. And now we have Web 3, and then we also have Web 3.0, which is not Web 3, and it's not a follow-on to Web 2.0. And the only thing that I learned in this process is that we're really bad at naming things. Like world-class industry, of all the industries, nobody is worse at naming things than technology. And so when I started looking at the history, diving into it, when we talk about Web 1.0 or Web 1 or the World Wide Web, right? The mode of operation that we had was largely an exchange of information through pages. Right? And this is actually quite important, because what that meant is that the web was very pull-oriented. We would go out, we would look for information, we had to know where it was in order to find it. And then some people made some search engines, and they were pretty bad until Google came along, and that was like, whoa, this is way better. But you still had to go and search and find the website. And you were mostly reading information. The good news is that there was a pretty low barrier to entry. If you wanted to produce information, you could create your own website, but it was hard to find a web host. The technology wasn't super great. How many people here remember uploading directly to prod with FTP? It was kind of the Wild West, right? And the other thing is technology then was a pain in the ass. We had different browsers. You had the browser wars, Netscape versus Internet Explorer. JavaScript was like a toy. Nobody really knew what was going on. And so it was hard for people to create good quality content. So it was still a very pull-oriented way of doing things. Sometimes, when I talk about Web3 with people, I get these 22-year-old crypto bros that try to tell me that Web 1 was all about centralization. Web 1 was just to make everything centralized. And I'm like, dude, I was there. I was building websites for 5 years when you were born. That's not what it was about. It was never about that. At no point in the history of the web was centralization the goal. And this is a really interesting thing. Because when we start talking about Web 2 or Web 2.0, everyone says Web 2.0 was all about centralization and it was all about scale. And that's partly true. But it's not true about how we got to that point. Web 2.0, if you go back, one fun exercise is with any technology or any trend, go to the Wikipedia page, look at the edit history, and go back like 10 or so years. If you go back on the Web 2.0 page in Wikipedia, it's a totally different content, like philosophically almost opposite of what the page reads now. It says Web 2.0 is about decentralization. But what made Web 2.0 different was that sometime in the early 2000s, we developed AJAX. And then we developed things like jQuery. And with those technologies, with those methods, the sort of converging standardization of web technologies, we developed infinite scroll. And I think that of all of the things that we've developed, infinite scroll is probably the most underrated approach for how we assess why the internet is the way it is today, right? Twitter wouldn't be Twitter if you didn't just like sit there and doom scroll forever. Instagram wouldn't be Instagram if you weren't like this for hours, right? What this did, though, is it translated us from being a pull-oriented consumer model to a push-oriented content developer. If there was a revolution in Web 2.0, it was that it turned all of us into content engines, right? The other thing that happened at this point was that it became metrics-driven and scale-oriented. So with the original internet, we didn't have, auto-scaling technologies. If you got to a certain size, that was a problem, but nobody ever got to that size because the internet was still small and too few people had it. So people really didn't have those problems the way that we have those problems today. This started in Web 2.0 when people started getting broadband and adopting the internet and learning how to use it. And what led to the centralization pattern wasn't that it was by design. It was that a few companies got really good at implementing these specific technologies. And that's why we see the way that we have the internet today. That's why Twitter is Twitter. That's why Facebook is Facebook. They were the ones who figured out how to do this the best and the fastest. And then we have Web 3.0, which is a totally different thing. This is, again, not Web 3. This Web 3.0 is actually really interesting. It's a little bit unknown, or not, I wouldn't say unknown, but it's not hyped the way that Web 3 is. Web 3.0 is Tim Berners-Lee's project, the Solid project. This is a way to decentralize how you own your data. It's actually really cool. I'd like to see more development in it. But this is, probably where we could have gone with the trend towards decentralization on the internet. I mean, if anyone is going to tell you what Web 3.0 should be, it's Tim Berners-Lee. As an aside, there's a little sort of hidden secret about the technology industry here with this image. Some of you might know the grade progressions, the typical grade progression in technology. You have like juniors, and you have seniors, you have leads and staff and principals. And then this is the rare V. So what is actually Web 3 when we get here? Web 3 is supposedly about decentralization, and it's supposedly about decentralization through the blockchain. And it says, the big change is you're no longer going to have to go to Facebook. You're no longer going to have to go to Twitter. You don't need to use these banks, these centralized government-controlled entities. Everything is going to be liberated because nobody can control the narrative. Nobody can control the source of truth. And so when you start talking about, with Web3 experts, like what are they really into? There's things like blockchain and cryptocurrencies and NFTs and DAOs and smart contracts and all this other stuff. And then like sometime around January of this year, people started mentioning the Metaverse in terms of Web3. And that was interesting. And the reason that was interesting is because here, on the one hand, they're like, Web3 is totally decentralized. We're going to solve the problem that those evil Facebook people created. And then they're like, and then there's the Metaverse, which is being built by Facebook, and this is awesome. Right? So there's this sort of tension here. But there's also something interesting, because in this Metaverse idea, it's very entangled with Web3, but it doesn't seem to fit, because the Metaverse isn't about the blockchain. If you talk to people about things like the Metaverse, what can you use it for? Oh, it's like a 3D space that like you can go in and you can do remote meetings or like teach people things or whatever. there's some cool stuff there, but none of it requires the blockchain. You can do that now. There was like this New York Times article, I think it was the New York Times. They're like, is it possible to like organize teams of people to achieve a common goal in 3D virtual worlds? And I'm like, yeah, I was doing that like in 2003 playing EverQuest. Like, this has been around for 20 years. And then as I was digging it more and more into this, like, why do we call these things revolutionary? What is it actually changing? I started to realize something. The first thing is that Web3 is not decentralized. It's just a different form of centralization. If you look at cryptocurrency theory, if you look at blockchain theory, sure, in theory it's decentralized. But when you look at it in practice, there was a great article in Bloomberg by Matthew Levine a few weeks ago. If you look at it in practice, it's actually very centralized because cryptocurrency exchanges are very hard to operate. You need a way to have people buy in. You know, the miners and the validators are very expensive to operate. So it becomes just a different kind of a centralized model, right? And you know, this is, if there's anybody who knows this, it's this guy, right? This is Jack Dorsey, the former, now the former CEO of Twitter. And he knows what he's doing, what he's talking about in this particular case, because he's trying to create these things. He was the guy that was pushing, you know, Twitter to adopt NFT avatars and stuff like that. So when we look at things like Web3, I would actually start to add one more class of technology to this stack. And then maybe you could convince me that it's starting to get revolutionary. And this other technology is what I like to just call generative algorithms. So this is deepfakes, this is GPT-3, this is your stable diffusion, right? The ability to use AI to generate sort of creative constructs of some form. Now, I'm going to jump over to this. Now, I couldn't embed this because computers are a pain, so I'm going to sort of ruin the surprise by playing this, but I'm going to play this podcast and just take a listen.
Great in the world, truly revolutionary, you have a responsibility to push to keep making it even better. It's like when we launched the Macintosh and we had the 1984 commercial and a big launch party. The day after that, I was in the back room with all the engineers getting ready to do what I should be doing, which is making it really great. And I remember thinking, why are we promoting this product? What's the big deal about this product?
So you could probably figure it out if you read the text up there while that was going on. That podcast never happened. That interview between Joe Rogan and Steve Jobs never happened. That was purely generated. Their voices were generated with AI. The text was generated with AI. But if you listen to what the Steve Jobs character is saying, it sounds pretty compelling. It sounds like something that he might say. It sounds like the questions that Joe Rogan might ask. Now, there's a bit of the way to go to get the inflection and the intonation of their speech right, but it's actually pretty compelling that you can take the corpus of what Steve Jobs has said and done that's been recorded, what he has written, what he has presented, and that you can use that to generate something that he has never ever said before. Then I started realizing that there are a couple of books and a couple of older pieces of work about technology that are very important. One of these is the Ray Kurzweil book, The Singularity is Near. This book came out in 2005. This was a very influential book to a certain group of people. In The Singularity is Near, Ray Kurzweil basically says technology is accelerating so quickly that eventually it will bypass human abilities for intelligence. Moreover, we will be able to integrate our biological selves into digital or technological systems. In other words, this sort of sci-fi theory about uploading your consciousness will soon be possible. When I started remembering that book, I also read this book by Matthew Ball that came out this year about the Metaverse. This is a long sort of overview of what the Metaverse could be, and he lays out all of the technical challenges that we will need to solve in order to create this vision of a persistent, immersive, data-rich 3D world. And I read this, and he introduces cryptocurrency sort of out of the blue, because the first half of the book, none of this requires a blockchain. We know how to build 3D worlds. It's hard. Data standardization is a challenging problem, but none of it requires cryptocurrency. And then I started thinking about this. If you have a digital world, and you create a digital currency that is untethered to physical production, and you blend those things together, now you have a purely digital economy. And if you create digital scarcity through NFTs, now you're creating an economy built around scarcity, built around production in a digital space. And then if you start doing things with blockchain and you start standardizing a data economy in this world, then you can start integrating larger worlds in a standardized way. And everyone has the same shared reality. And then finally, if you bring generated algorithms into this, you can actually generate simulated reality. So now take this concept. You have the metaverse, you're wearing your 3D glasses, and you pay with cryptocurrency to walk into a physically unique place that's guaranteed by some sort of NFT, and you sit down with a deep fake rendering of Steve Jobs, and you can ask him any question, and the AI that powers his answers is so good and so rich that you cannot separate what he is actually saying to you from what he would have said in real life. His personality, the way he says it, the way he reacts to what you say. That's an interesting world. And when we look at what Ray Kurzweil is saying about the singularity, what we're actually talking about is digital immortality. So I promise you that this would get a little bit weird. Now, do I actually believe in this? I don't know, but it's actually a compelling vision because I'll get to this in a moment. There are people who really believe in this, and these are people who have a lot of money and a lot of influence in the technology industry. So what I started to realize is that NFTs, cryptocurrency, all of this stuff, this isn't to revolutionize the way that we do payments, although that might be an outcome. This is to revolutionize something else. This is to create some sort of way to live on forever. Now, if you've heard this before, it's because all of this has happened before, and all of this will happen again. But it's actually quite a terrifying concept when you think about it. If somebody can create a physical space in which they hold all the wealth and scarcity is real, they're doing that now. They are basically able to extract their wealth over a longer period of time. So we should start thinking about this in very real terms. In 2011, the New Yorker published an article called No Death, No Taxes, based on sort of, I think it was a Mark Twain quote, the only two certainties in life are death and taxes. This was a profile of Peter Thiel. And he basically says, in this, that death is a problem that can be solved. The article goes into great length about his unease and his discomfort with the idea of mortality. And he's investing in things like neural interfaces with computers and metaverse and cryptocurrency, right? He's putting a lot of energy into funding people who truly believe that this is the future of technology. And then Elon Musk the other day, he writes something on Twitter. He owns it now. He can write whatever he wants there. He called that Twitter is a collective cybernetic superintelligence. I'm not going to agree with that, but it shows you where he's thinking. How many of people here are on Twitter? Okay, a lot of you. Just so you're aware, you are not part of a cybernetic superintelligence. It's not very super intelligent at all there. Twitter's an interesting place. Twitter is like the only place where it's completely normal to be furiously angry with the mayor of a city you've never been to. So don't worry. Twitter is not evolving into a cybernetic superintelligence. But Elon Musk, who also is the CEO of Neuralink, sure would like it to. Now, I float this theory through a couple people, and they ask me a couple of questions. They say, like, first of all, Emily, are you on drugs? Second of all, where do I get them? But actually, this is interesting, right? So Facebook is just doing a bunch of layoffs, or I'm sorry, Meta is doing a bunch of layoffs. I shouldn't dead name Facebook. Meta is doing a bunch of layoffs, and part of their severance package, according to this journalist, is real estate in the metaverse. Like, I'm sorry, but there's a point at which when you work really hard for somebody and they promise you a place in the promised land in the afterlife, this is moving away from technology and into something that's a little bit cult-like. It's a little bit uneasy, right? So the question is any of this real? Now, probably some of you are like, this is like nonsense talk. But then again, when he wrote The Singularity is Real, Ray Kurzweil said that by 2045, we will all be sentient energy just vibing in the universe, right? He believed that the technology singularity was so close that in 22 years and 2 months' time, we will just be floating through the ether as hyper-intelligent, AI-augmented, non-physical, energy-based life forms, right? They made him a director at Google. So you can bear with me for a little bit longer. So I've said this word revolution a couple of times. When I think about revolution, I kind of want to go back to the roots. What actually is a revolution? Hannah Arendt says that revolutions are the only political events that confront us directly and inevitably with the problem of beginning. She says that revolutions create what she calls publics, which are conducive to action, and that true revolution only happens when actors create immortality for themselves in a public forum that allows their name to be passed on for generations. This is a really interesting take on revolutions when you think about what I just presented. For a somewhat different take, Rosa Luxemburg has a different sort of point of view, that revolution stands in contrast to reform. She says that revolution is an act of political creation, but revolution and reform are not hot and cold sausages that you can pick out from the deli counter. Reform is not a slower and more tranquil way to achieve the same goals as revolution. Sorry, there's a typo here. As revolution. That revolution is about the disruption of power. If any of you have been through technology development, this actually is fairly familiar. You can add features to a piece of software for a certain period of time, but eventually you need to refactor and you need to build a totally different version of the software. You need a different approach, right? So Rosa Luxemburg says that revolution is about disrupting power, and I would take both of these ideas and say that revolutions are about the change in the shape of power. So if we're going to talk about revolutionizing something with technology, we need to think about how we are changing those shapes of power. When we talk about the music industry, we didn't change the shape of power at all. The superstars still made a bunch of money. Everyone else had to play their guitar in the U-Bahn station to make a living at playing the guitar. And a bunch of record companies got really, really rich. And then they sued a bunch of college students who were just playing around in a computer. That wasn't a revolution. It actually reified that shape of power. So in order to create a revolution, we need to think about what is the current balance of power and who is currently changing it. And this is where I started to look at where this is actually happening in the world today. So last night, my home country, the United States, had the midterm elections. This was a big deal because for the last 2 years, we've been litigating whether or not Donald Trump actually lost the 2020 presidential election. And as some of you might remember, many of his fans got really, really, really big mad about it, and then they stormed the Capitol, and they were quite violent, and they tried to kill people, but they didn't find anybody to kill, so they just kind of wandered around for a little while, like a dog that actually caught the car for the first time. But what was interesting is they get into the Capitol, right? They stormed the castle. They're like, woohoo, we made it past the cops that they beat up and killed. They were looking for the politicians, and they didn't find anything anywhere. So what did they do? They took out their phones and they started recording the crimes that they were doing, right? And then they posted these crimes on Facebook and Twitter and all of the other social media. And a bunch of independent sort of citizen journalists started saving these. And they started going through these pictures, these videos, frame by frame. And they would name these people who committed these crimes. This guy was breaking the glass, so they would call him Red Hat Black Blazer or whatever. And they shared this on Twitter, and they called themselves the Sedition Hunters. And it turns out they were really good at finding these people, way better than the FBI. And the FBI even called this out. Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, even referenced the citizen sleuths around the country that are helping do this. And if you actually look at the court documents, you see their work coming up over and over and over again. And a lot of times they actually just, they would call the FBI and they say, hey, I found this guy. And the FBI is like, whoa, how'd you do that? They're like, I looked at his Facebook page. Maybe you should try that. And so you might say, if you're a leftist like me, you'd be like, Emily, calling the FBI is not a revolutionary act, and that's true. But this idea of shifting the balance of power, of investigating who is responsible for doing bad acts, is something quite powerful. There's an anti-fascist group operating in the US right now called Ignite the Right. What they are doing is they're going through footage from 5 years ago in my home city of Charlottesville, Virginia, where there's a huge neo-Nazi rally. They're going through to identify the people who have not yet been named. And the goal here is not to put them in jail. The goal here is to shame them so that they can't ever do this again. Just a few weeks ago, they found this guy. I'm not going to name him because I don't know what Sweden's defamation laws are, but you could find him if you want to. They found this guy. On the left is a picture of him acting as a bodyguard for the infamous neo-Nazi Richard Spencer. The middle picture is his real estate agent headshot. This group, Ignite the Right, they used facial recognition software on this image of his face to find matching images of people who had their pictures published online. So anti-fascists were starting to use the same tools and technology that law enforcement supposedly uses to track people down. What's interesting about this is if you want to talk about disrupting the balance of power, not only was this guy a real estate agent, he was also a police officer in Woburn, Massachusetts, who had for 5 years been living a double life as a secret neo-Nazi while also roaming around the town with a gun and a badge doing who knows what. After he was named by this anti-fascist group, the prosecutor in Woburn, Massachusetts, promised that they would take a look at all of his open cases for the past 5 years to investigate for any impropriety or any bias. This is a powerful idea that an anonymous group of people 5 years after the act could track somebody down like this. This idea of open source intelligence has also grown into what's happening in the war in Ukraine. This is a scroll of the Oryx blog. Oryx is a Dutch sort of citizen journalist who tracks military expenditures, military transfers of equipment, and conflict. And he and his team have been going through and looking at all of the images posted in social media, Twitter, Telegram, VK, Facebook, wherever, from the war in Ukraine. They've been taking these pictures, these very detailed photos of tanks and trucks and things that have been captured or blown up or whatever, and they go through and they uniquely identify each one. And they post this picture on their blog, and they link to it. And so they're able to actually track how many visually confirmed destroyed pieces of equipment each side has in this war. What's really interesting is this is like one guy and a team of like maybe 8 or 9 other volunteers who are doing this. Pretty much actually just 2 guys. October 7th, the British Ministry of Defense posts its daily update about the war, and they say that Ukraine has likely captured at least 440 Russian main battle tanks. If you go to the Oryx blog from that day, they list 449 captured tanks. So here you have one very obsessed guy who loves military equipment outperforming the entire British Ministry of Defense at intelligence gathering for a major conflict in Europe. That seems a little imbalanced. Speaking of the conflict in Ukraine, there's an interesting story in The Guardian earlier this year. Some of you remember the column of Russian soldiers and equipment that was advancing on Kyiv. This is an image from a street in Bucha where a bunch of equipment was destroyed by Ukrainian troops, either in an airstrike or artillery or who knows what. What a lot of people don't know is that the reason that that convoy stalled was because of a group called Aerorozvidka. This group was a bunch of IT and engineering specialists who had figured out how to use 3D printers to build fins, mounting mechanisms, and release mechanisms for bombs to attach to consumer drones. They then flew these drones out over where the convoy was driving, blew up some of the vehicles. In the first night, they blew up 3 lead vehicles of the convoy with these consumer drones. You could go out to the store and buy them for probably 200 euros. This halted the convoy, and over the next several nights, they went through and they targeted fuel trucks, ammunition trucks, surface-to-air missile launchers. They systematically walked up through that convoy, destroying these vehicles, which prevented the Russian army from advancing on Kyiv. These were 30 computer nerds. We're all computer nerds. Think about that. 50 years of geopolitics said that Russia had the second most powerful army in the world. These 30 guys showed that they don't have this, that they have the second most powerful army in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine created a lot of really weird stuff. Again, this has been a really weird year. A lot of weird stuff. I found this video on YouTube. I'm going to play it briefly for you. I'll turn off the sound. This is a video of a German soldier with the Bundeswehr giving instructions on how to use a Panzerfaust 3, an anti-tank rocket launcher. This is like a tutorial for how to use an anti-tank missile. That's kind of fucked up, right? Like, when the war started, there were a bunch of like defense analysts and whatever. They started posting instructions on how to make Molotov cocktails. Like, I'm a public anti-fascist. If I posted instructions on how to make a Molotov cocktail, I would go to jail for terrorism. And I thought about showing that to prove it to you, but I'm still afraid that I will go to jail for terrorism. It was also interesting during the war because the Ukrainian army created an IT army. Maybe you were familiar with this. They created an IT army to hack Russian infrastructure. This is a YouTube video from my friend Tejas. He put a little 3-minute tutorial about how to DDoS a website using Docker and Bombardier. And it's just hanging out under his real name. Like, this is a crime. Like, this is still illegal, but we don't care because it's Russia, right? In like overnight, this changed. I hope I don't get him in trouble for that. So we had this situation where like the entire standards of what was okay completely changed in reaction to what was going on in the world. And now you can't put this toothpaste back in the tube, right? All of this information is now out there. So now anyone who wants to make a Molotov cocktail, I don't recommend doing it. I don't want to go to jail for terrorism, can pretty easily find these instructions, right? This was stuff that was super penalized at one point in time. There are people in the UK who are in jail currently just for visiting a site that had the instructions for how to make Molotov cocktails. This like sort of political thing, we had the election I mentioned yesterday in the US, was really weird because this summer, politicians in the US kind of figured out that there's no provision in like campaigns finance laws if you pay random TikTokers to spread your message. So they started finding influencers on Instagram and TikTok to like send political messages. And in this one case, this woman, Grace, went on like dating sites, and whenever she would match with somebody that agreed with her on abortion rights, she would then like stump for the candidate as part of a campaign called Hot Girls Vote. This is like really bleak. It's really bleak that you can't even go to a dating site now without some politician paying an influencer to ask for your vote. I think that there's some of this stuff that is actually a little bit weird. Right? If everyone minded their own business, the world would go around a great deal faster than it does. Perhaps that's true. So where does this bring us with actually revolutions? I think that one of the things that we forget is that sometimes revolutions fail. In the wonderful book Twitter and Tear Gas by Zeynep Tufekci, she says that in studying the Arab Spring and the revolution in Egypt, governments found a new way to censor information, not by making it unavailable, but by making that information unusable to the people who could find it. This was a total change in the dynamics of how people organized. So you had this reaction, counter-reaction going on Twitter in 2011 during this war. It was a very interesting situation. But sometimes also, when you try to create a revolution, what you actually do is you create a counter-revolution. And sometimes you become the enemy. If you remember Dig back in the day, back before Reddit became popular and before Twitter became popular and Facebook was still weird, still had the poke. Anyone remember Facebook pokes? Dig was like the hot stuff, right? They were in talks to sell to Google for $200 million in 2008. 4 years later, they sold to a company called BetaWorks for $500,000. That's a 3 order of magnitude drop in their valuation in 4 years. But actually, it happened faster than that, right? On August 25th, 2010, Dig launched version 4 of their website. This version removed some of the core features that users were used to. This was done in an effort to try to prevent influence campaigns and fraud on the site with the voting system. Users revolted, and within a week, the CEO had to step down. The site collapsed so fast that the CEO didn't last a week. By 2 months later, October 27, Dig laid off 37% of its staff, and unfortunately for them at the time, the Metaverse did not exist, so they did not get any digital real estate. So how do we create revolutions, and what power do we challenge? This becomes the central theme. I don't have an answer to this question. But when I studied what we were doing with technology, and when I compared what people like Elon Musk are trying to do with Twitter with what these Ukrainian IT engineers were doing with drones, I started to think that there's actually something here. There's something revolutionary about all of it. It's just we're all trying to compete against a different form of power. But I will give you some rules for revolution because I want you to go out and create a revolution. Again, trying not to go to jail for terrorism. But I want you to create a revolution with technology. The first rule is that revolutions always come as a surprise, at least to some. The Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman said in 1998, this is 1998, not 1988, 1998 said, by 2005, it will become clear that the internet's impact on the economy has been no greater than the fax machines. How did that one work out? So even people who are very smart will fail to see the revolution that's right in front of them. The second, using this sort of Arendtian framing, revolutions create public forums that allow people to act. One of the things that was interesting about the war in Ukraine is not only was hacking all of a sudden legal, and not only was it all of a sudden legal to post information about how to build a Molotov cocktail, but the engineers that showed that the drones were effective, they needed more of them. They needed more cameras, they needed more drones, they needed more 3D printers. Right? Some of this stuff was export controlled, particularly the thermal imaging cameras and the digital modems. They needed people to help, they needed to crowdfund a bypass to international arms trafficking regulations by asking friends and family. Once again, it was kind of like, okay, yeah, cool, I'll help you violate arms trafficking laws. That's no problem. So they went to eBay, they went to friends and family, they bought this equipment, right? They created that public forum for people to act. The third rule is that we cannot design the outcome of a revolution. When talking to the Sedition Hunters, they said, if you tried to design the way that we do things, if you tried to create that from scratch, it would have failed. The only way for this to have worked is if it emerged organically, right? All of these examples that I've given you about the current ways that people are using technology have one thing in common. That one thing is that a small group of perhaps obsessive but dedicated individuals were able to create the conditions for change to upset the most powerful organizations in the world. So this idea that we want to create a revolution is actually really compelling. So what do we need to do it? We can't create this by ourselves, right? None of you can probably go out and say, I want to create this revolution. That's not how it works. But what we can do is give users the tools to create those revolutions, right? These folks used what tools they had available to them: social media, 3D printers, drones, networks, chat forums, all of that stuff, facial recognition tools. They used that technology that was available to them, and none of that technology by itself was revolutionary. The revolution that came because they learned how to put it together in a way that created a challenge to a power structure that power structure could not anticipate or react to. That leads me to the next point. So we're building the metaverse, and people say that the metaverse is going to be revolutionary. And I think actually it's true. Facebook will eventually revolutionize legs. But this idea of challenging the existing power structure of mortality is actually a really interesting idea. Not because I want to live forever or think that anybody should, but if you can challenge a natural law through technology, what else could you do to enhance the way that we're living in the world? So if you want the metaverse to be powerful, and I do believe that there are really compelling things that are here in this theory, if you want this to be powerful, you have to give users the freedom. There's another metaverse application out there. It's called VR Chat. Unsurprisingly, it's really popular among the furry community who have used it to create fitness classes in the metaverse. And they have legs. So we could actually create a metaverse that was revolutionary, but we cannot possibly do it if all we are trying to do is create it to generate wealth and immortality for ourselves. The subtitle of the Matthew Ball book on the metaverse is how it will revolutionize everything. And in the first chapter of the book, he breathlessly talks about the trillions of dollars of earning potential that the metaverse has, and how this earning potential is going to just drive the technology adoption, it's going to drive computing, and we're going to spend all of this money to revolutionize the way that children learn about ancient Rome or something, I don't know, virtual meetings, right? There was no compelling story there. Because at the end of the day, the way that people are using these technologies like NFTs and cryptocurrency and the metaverse have been hyper-focused around generating a lot of wealth for themselves and retaining a lot of power. And so I will leave you with the last and final rule for revolutions. And that is that there are very few examples of successful revolutions in history where people revolted so that they could become gods, so that they could become powerful. Wars have been fought, but power has not been usurped in that way. However, there are many, many examples of revolutions in history where people have sought to prevent people from doing exactly that. Thank you very much.